They sold an Apache Orphan for $2, until a giant mountain man fought to bring her home. The wind tore through Silver Crossing, like it was hunting something that didn't belong, rattling the shutters of the trading post and sending the sign creaking above the door where a man named Boone Kettering stood watching the exchange that would damn the town's conscience for good. He was 6.5 feet of muscle and silence, a mountain of a man who'd come down from the high ridges only twice a year for supplies and news. But what he saw that morning made him forget both. Inside, behind the counter, a merchant in a fur vest was counting coins into his palm. 2 silver dollars, shining cold and small in the firelight. In front of him, an army sergeant in a dust-streaked uniform held a shivering child by the wrist, her hair black as raven wings, her eyes wide but dry. "Two's fair," the sergeant said. "She's half-starved and don't speak no English. Army can't keep every orphan." The trader shrugged, sliding the coins into a box. "Fair's what a man agrees to." Boone's voice rumbled low behind them. "That ain't a sale, that's a sin." The room went still. The sergeant turned, jaw tight. "You got a problem, Mountain?" Boone stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the light. "Only with men who weigh souls in silver." The trader smirked. "Ain't your concern, giant. She's property of the fort." Boone looked down at the girl, bare feet cut from travel, a bruise across her cheek, still standing proud despite the tremble in her lip. And something in him shifted, a memory of another winter when he'd been too late to stop a cruelty much the same. "She got a name?" he asked. The sergeant frowned. "None that matters." Boone's hand dropped to his belt, where the worn handle of his knife caught the light. "Then I reckon I'll buy her name back." "You can't just—" The trader started, but Boone tossed a heavy gold coin onto the counter, its thud cutting through the wind outside. "That worth a soul to you?" he said. The man's fingers twitched. "Take her and go." Boone crouched beside the child, his voice softer now. "You're coming with me, little one." She didn't move at first, then reached out, clutching his coat with fingers so small he could feel the bones through them. As they stepped into the storm, Boone looked back once. "World's full of men who'd sell a child for $2, he muttered. But today, it met one who won't. And the wind seemed to bow as he carried her into the cold. Boone rode until the town shrank behind him, the storm closing like a curtain, snow cutting his face and wind biting through his coat. But he didn't slow. The girl sat before him on the saddle, small enough to vanish in his arms, silent as the grave, but warm against his chest. When the ridge opened to a clearing, he stopped beneath an old pine and built a fire from dry bark and kindling he carried wrapped in oilskin. She watched him without flinching, her eyes huge, reflecting the flames like mirrors of the world she no longer trusted. Boone tore a strip of jerky and held it out. "You eat?" She didn't answer, only stared at his hand, then at the fire, as if unsure which one would hurt her less. "Name?" he asked quietly. "Nothing." The wind carried only the crackle of the flames and the sigh of the mountain. He softened his voice, slower, like speaking to a skittish colt. "I'm Boone. You?" After a long pause, she whispered something so faint it could have been the wind. "Taya." He nodded once, repeating it under his breath. "Taya. Means brave, don't it?" She blinked, surprised he knew, but said nothing. He smiled slightly. "Figured so? Takes courage to look at a man like me and not run." She almost smiled then, just enough to catch the firelight. He handed her the jerky again. This time she took it, chewing slow, still watching him. Boone leaned back against the pine, pulling his coat tighter around her shoulders. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you again," he murmured. "Not while I breathe." She finished eating, eyes drooping with exhaustion, and rested her head against his chest, the steady beat of his heart finally loud enough to drown the wind. Boone stared into the fire, jaw clenched, remembering another winter. His brother's boy, taken in a raid, never found. The ache that had followed him through every lonely mile since. Maybe this was his chance to set something right. He lifted his gaze to the sky, snow swirling through the smoke like prayers that never stopped rising. "World's wrong plenty," he whispered, half to God, half to himself. "But maybe it ain't beyond fixin'." When he looked down, the girl was asleep, her fingers still gripping his coat like a promise. Boone fed the fire and watched until the snow turned silver under the dawn. He had found her name, and with it, a reason to keep riding. By mid-morning, the sky cleared to a hard, cold blue, and Boone saddled his horse again, wrapping Taya in his spare blanket before lifting her into the saddle. She woke when he tightened the reins, blinking up at him with wary calm. "We going home?" she asked softly, the first full words he'd heard her speak. Boone hesitated, then said, "We're right in that direction, yeah. Home's wherever they stop taking from you." They rode through canyons where snow turned the world to bone and silence, their breath visible like ghosts of things once alive. By noon, Boone spotted the smoke of another settlement, Mason Creek, a trading hub built between the pines and the frozen river. He didn't like towns much, but he needed supplies and answers. The trader back in Silver Crossing hadn't looked smart enough to start such a trade on his own. Someone higher had given permission to sell what no man should own. As they rode in, men watched from porches, eyes tracking the child wrapped against his chest. A voice called from the general store. "That her, Boone?" It was a wiry man named Caleb Shaw, an old trapper who knew too much about everyone. "Heard the army been moving kids through the forts. Word is, $2 buys you a conscience these days." Boone reined in, jaw tight. "You seen anyone leading it?" Caleb shrugged. "Heard the name Captain Ellis. Runs supply lines for Fort Garland. Some say he sells more than whiskey." Boone's knuckles went white on the reins. "He's still stationed up there?" "Last I heard." Caleb glanced at Taya. "You thinking of taking her back?" Boone looked down at her small face, peeking from the blanket. "I'm thinking of taking back what they stole. From her, from every one of us." Caleb sighed. "You'll make enemies." "Ain't new to me." He dismounted, carrying Taya inside the store, where heat from the stove melted the frost on her hair. She reached for a jar of honey on the counter, eyes wide with hunger, and Boone nodded for the clerk to wrap it. "Put it on my tab," he said. The clerk hesitated, then whispered, "You going after soldiers?" Boone looked him dead in the eye. "I'm going after thieves wearing their clothes." Outside, the wind had risen again, carrying the sound of something old and restless through the pines. Boone placed Taya back in the saddle and turned toward the mountains. "They bought you for $2, he said quietly. "Let's see what it costs them to lose you." The trail to Fort Garland was carved through canyons still scarred by war. Bones of old camps half buried in snow, the ghosts of battles nobody bothered to remember. Boone rode with his shoulders hunched against the cold, every step of his horse crunching like glass beneath iron. Taya slept most of the way, her head against his chest, small breaths fogging the inside of his coat. When the fort finally came into view, gray stone walls under a bruised sky, Boone felt something old and dangerous wake inside him. The gate guards eyed him as he approached, one smirking. "You lost, giant?" Boone's voice carried like thunder. I'm looking for Captain Ellis. The guard spat. Ain't here. Took a patrol south. When's he back? Tomorrow, maybe. You want to wait. Find a bed in town. Ain't no lodging for strays in the fort. Boone's eyes narrowed. Didn't come for comfort. He turned his horse and rode toward the nearby settlement. 3 shacks, a saloon, and a church standing lonely against the wind. He paid for a room in the stable loft, laid down a blanket for Taya, and built a small fire in a tin drum. She sat cross-legged beside it, clutching the little wooden doll he'd carved for her on the ride. You angry? She asked. Boone glanced up from cleaning his rifle. At the men who sold you. At the men who led him. She tilted her head. Then why don't you hate the world? He smiled faintly. 'Cause if I did, you'd have no one left to trust. That night, he lay awake listening to the snow tapping on the roof, the whisper of soldiers' laughter outside. Near dawn, footsteps crunched in the alley, measured, deliberate. Boone eased up, hand on his rifle. The door creaked open, and a man stepped in, face thin, eyes cold. Boone Kettering, he said. You're making noise in places you shouldn't. Boone stood slowly, the light catching the scar along his jaw. Then maybe you ought to ask why there's noise at all. The man smiled like a snake. Captain Ellis don't like folks meddling in his business. He paid for those orphans fair through Army supply. Fair? Boone's voice dropped, rough as gravel. Tell him I'll see him tomorrow. He can bring his papers. I'll bring the truth. The man hesitated, then backed out into the snow. Boone shut the door and sat by the fire, jaw hard. Tomorrow, he whispered, watching the flames curl higher. We start giving the lost back their names. The sun rose pale and cold, lighting the fort's gray walls like the ribs of some ancient beast. Boone saddled his horse before dawn, leaving Taya with the innkeeper's wife, a kind woman who promised to keep her safe. You'll come back? The girl asked, gripping his hand. You got my word, Boone said, and something in his tone made it sound heavier than a promise. It was a vow. The fort stirred with life as he rode in. Soldiers marched, smoke curled from chimneys, and a man in a crisp blue coat stood near the gate, watching Boone's approach like a hawk eyeing prey. Captain Ellis, Boone said flatly. The officer smiled thinly. So you're the mountain that's been rattling my men. I hear you took one of my orphans. She ain't yours, Boone replied. You bought her from a soldier for $2. A fair exchange, Ellis said with a shrug. Army doesn't feed mouths that don't fight. You got one, I got coin. It balances. Boone's glare could have cut stone. You ever held a child who don't cry 'cause she's too tired to remember how? Ellis's smirk faltered for a heartbeat, then returned, brittle. You're not a preacher, so don't pretend to be. The frontier's full of dirty trades. Boone stepped closer until their breath met in the cold air. Then I reckon I'll start cleaning. 2 soldiers tensed nearby, rifles shifting, but Ellis lifted a hand. You threaten me, I'll hang you. Boone's voice was calm. You'll try. A long silence stretched, broken only by the wind rattling the flag above the fort. Ellis laughed softly. You don't scare me, Mountain. Men like you burn out. The world forgets your kind. Boone leaned in close, his words a growl. Then maybe it's time the world remembered. He turned and walked away before the soldiers could move, his boots crunching through frost. Ellis's smile slipped the moment Boone was gone, replaced by the twitch of a man who just glimpsed the end of his piece. Back at the stable, Boone found Taya waiting, a blanket around her shoulders. Did he say sorry? She asked. Boone knelt, meeting her eyes. No, but he will. She reached into her pocket and pulled out one of the silver coins, the same ones the trader had used to buy her. You dropped this, she said. Boone looked at it, then at her. Keep it, he said quietly. Let it remind you what you ain't worth. As they packed to leave, snow began to fall again, thick and silent, covering the tracks of a man about to start a war. By nightfall, the fort behind them glowed with torchlight like a nest of hornets disturbed, and Boone knew the captain wouldn't let it go. He rode hard for the ridge, keeping Taya close, the snow turning to sleet that hissed against his coat. When they reached a narrow pass above the valley, he stopped to rest the horse and built a small fire beneath a rock ledge. Taya curled against him, holding the wooden doll he'd carved, tracing its tiny face with her thumb. Why do they hate us? She whispered. Boone stared into the flames. They don't hate you, Taya. They just don't see what they're doing. Some men lose their eyes without going blind. She looked up. Can they get them back? If they want to. He tossed another stick into the fire, his jaw tightening. But some don't. In the valley below, he saw torches moving. 5, maybe 6 riders coming fast. Boone stood, doused the fire, and lifted Taya into the saddle. Hold on, brave one. They rode into the trees as gunfire cracked behind them, bullets chewing bark and air. Boone's horse lunged forward, hooves pounding frozen earth. He turned into a ravine, the echo of pursuit close behind. A shot grazed his arm, tearing his coat, but he didn't flinch. When the ravine narrowed, he swung down, lifted Taya, and pointed to a hollow under the rock. Stay there, no matter what you hear. She nodded, eyes wide. Boone turned back, knife drawn, breath steaming like smoke. The first rider appeared, face half hidden by a scarf, one of Ellis's men. Boone waited until the man dismounted, then stepped from the shadows, striking like thunder. The fight was short and brutal, over before the next soldier arrived. Boone grabbed the man's rifle and crouched low, aiming into the dark. A second shot rang out. A soldier fell. The others hesitated, shouting to each other in confusion. Boone used the pause to slip through the trees, silent as the wind, circling behind them. By the time they realized, he was gone, vanished into the night's teeth. He returned to the hollow, breath ragged, sleeve soaked red. Taya reached for his arm. You hurt? Had worse, he said, forcing a smile. You cold? She shook her head. You scared? She thought for a long moment, then whispered, Not when you're here. Boone pulled her close and looked toward the fort's distant lights. Then I'll stay here, he said softly, until the world learns the price of what it took. When dawn crept over the ridges, the snow had crusted into glittering glass, and Boone's breath came out in clouds of steam as he packed their gear. His arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but he barely noticed. All he could think of was the face of Captain Ellis smirking in that torchlight. Taya walked beside the horse, her small boots crunching through the ice. Where we go now? She asked. Someplace warm, he said. Then maybe we find a man who'll listen. The nearest person worth trusting was an old Apache tracker named Sani, a friend from years past who lived beyond the river. By dusk, Boone found his smoke rising between the cottonwoods. The old man stepped out, bow drawn, then lowered it with a laugh when he saw who approached. Boone Kettering, he said. Didn't think the mountain still breathed. Only when I'm mad, Boone answered. Sani's eyes flicked to Taya. And now you bring fire with you. Boone nodded. She was sold. I took her back. The old tracker's smile vanished. Sold? $2, Boone said. Armies running a trade. Sani's face hardened like stone. The world never learns. He looked at the girl. You are Taya? She nodded shyly. Then you are of the Sparrow clan. Your mother's name was Naoli. She died 3 winters past. Your people still search. Boone's chest tightened. You can find them. I can call them, Sani said, but it will bring war to the men who took her. Boone's voice was steady. Then let it come. They stayed that night by the river, the fire painting gold across the ice. Taya fell asleep curled in Boone's coat, her hand resting over his heart. Sani watched them, smoke curling around his face. You think this mercy will save her? He asked. Boone stared into the flames. It'll save me if it don't. Sani grunted. Then tomorrow, we send word. In the distance, coyotes cried, and Boone knew they weren't alone in the dark. The mountain listened. The world shifted. And somewhere deep in the valley, torches began to move again. Too many for a search party, too slow for a patrol. Ellis wasn't done. Boone laid another log on the fire, his jaw tightening. They're coming, he said. Sani nodded. Then we will see whose spirit weighs heavier, gold or mercy. Boone reached for his rifle, eyes on the horizon where night burned red. Mercy, he said quietly. Always mercy. By midnight, the valley glowed with torchlight. A slow tide of soldiers threading between the cottonwoods. Boone crouched by the fire, checking his rifle one last time, while Sani scattered ashes over the flames to dull their glow. They bring 50 men, the old tracker said. Ellis wants his shame buried deep. Boone's jaws set like iron. Then he should have picked a quieter grave. Taya woke with a start, clutching the doll to her chest. They found us? Not yet, Boone said, tucking her under his coat. But they will. You stay behind the rocks when the fire starts. She nodded, her small face lit by the reflection of his knife as he cut the rope that tethered their horses. The wind shifted, carrying the faint rattle of spurs and the dry laughter of men who thought themselves hunters. Boone and Sani moved through the brush, ghosts in the silver light, setting pitch-soaked branches along the riverbank. You ever burn a bridge? Sani asked. Plenty, Boone said. Never one I didn't cross first. They waited until the first rider entered the shallows, the torches flaring bright against the water. Then Boone fired. One shot into the oil-soaked driftwood. Flames erupted, racing along the bank, painting the night in orange and gold. Horses screamed, soldiers shouted, chaos swallowed order. Boone stepped into the open, his massive silhouette framed in firelight. Captain Ellis, he roared, you got one chance to leave what ain't yours? A shot cracked back, grazing the air by his ear. He fired again, his bullet striking the torch in Ellis's hand and exploding it into sparks. You think you can fight the army? Ellis shouted. I'm fighting what the army forgot it was meant to protect, Boone called, voice carrying like thunder. Sani loosed arrows from the dark, swift and silent, cutting down 2 men before they found the river's edge. Ellis cursed, rallying his troops. But the current turned against them, flames leaping higher as smoke choked the air. Boone reloaded, breathing steady, eyes locked on the man who'd bought lives with silver. When Ellis raised his pistol again, Boone stepped closer, the fire at his back. You called her property, he growled. Now look what your greed owns. Ellis hesitated, fear flickering behind the fury. The next moment, Sani's arrow struck his shoulder, spinning him into the mud. Boone lowered his rifle. Enough, he said. Let the river take what's rotten. The flames hissed as snow began to fall, swallowing the night in light and ash. By dawn, the fires had died to smoke and steam, the river running black with ash. Boone stood on the bank beside Sani, the rifle slung across his back, eyes fixed on the horizon, where Fort Garland lay silent beneath a curtain of fog. "He'll crawl home," Sani said, voice calm, but not as the man who left. Boone nodded. Let him live with what he saw. That's punishment enough. Behind them, Taya stirred beneath a blanket, her cheeks pink with sleep. She blinked at the pale light filtering through the trees. "Is it over?" Boone crouched beside her. "For now, but there's one more road to ride." "Home?" she whispered. "Home," he said. Sani stepped forward, holding a carved wooden whistle in his weathered hands. "Your people are near," he told her. "The Sparrow clan waits in the canyon beyond the Red Mesa. When they hear this, they will come." Boone lifted her onto his horse, wrapping his coat around her one last time. "You ready?" She looked down, clutching the doll he'd carved. "Will you come with me?" He smiled faintly, that mountain smile that barely reached his eyes. "Some paths a man walks alone, but I'll see you from the ridge." They rode until noon, when the air warmed and the land opened into a wide basin of sage and sunlight. At the mesa's edge, Sani lifted the whistle and blew, the sound long and low, echoing across the valley like a prayer. Minutes later, riders appeared. 5, then 10, then more. Painted faces and feathers flashing in the light. A woman rode at the front, her hair streaked with gray, but her bearing strong. She dismounted slowly, eyes wide, as she looked at the child. "Taya?" The girl gasped, sliding from the saddle. "Auntie?" The woman ran forward, falling to her knees, arms wrapping around the child in a cry that broke the still air. Boone looked away, swallowing hard, the wind cold against his wet eyes. Sani placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did what few men dare. Fought for something that wasn't yours, and gave it back whole." Boone nodded, watching the reunion through a haze of smoke and sun. The woman approached, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her face. "You saved her," she said. "Our people will remember." Boone's voice was quiet. "Then remember what she's worth. No gold ever will." He turned his horse toward the north, the sound of drums rising faintly behind him, and the first eagle of morning circled overhead, its shadow long and sure on the red earth below. Boone rode north until the canyon walls swallowed the sound of the drums, his breath clouding in the cold light, his heart heavier than the pack on his saddle. He stopped at the ridge above the valley, where the pines bent in the wind and the sun broke through the smoke like gold spilled over the land. Below him, the Sparrow clan gathered around their fires, tiny figures moving like a single heartbeat against the red earth. He could just make out Taya's small form running between them, her laughter cutting through the distance, light and wild, the sound of something the world had almost lost. Boone smiled, small and tired, then turned his horse toward the high trail. But before he could ride on, Sani's voice rose from behind him. "You could stay." Boone didn't turn. "And teach her what? How to fight, how to lose, how to bury things too deep?" "How to live," Sani said. Boone's silence stretched until the wind filled it. "She's got a life now," he said finally. "She don't need ghosts watching her from the hill." Sani nodded, understanding. "Then what will you do?" Boone looked out at the endless line of mountains. "Same thing I've always done. Keep the storms from finding the weak." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last coin from the trader's box, turning it between his fingers before throwing it into the canyon. It flashed once, caught the light, and was gone. "That's what her life cost once," he said softly. Now it don't belong to anyone. He watched until the last of the fires below dimmed into embers, then rode higher into the mountains. The sound of his horse fading like thunder turned to memory. By nightfall, the sky stretched wide and full of stars. Boone made camp under an ancient pine, the same kind that had watched men rise and fall for centuries. He built a small fire and set Taya's wooden doll beside it, the carved face smiling into the flame. "She's home now," he murmured. "That's enough." He leaned back, the warmth brushing his weathered face, and for the first time in years, the ache in his chest eased. Somewhere in the distance, an eagle cried, and Boone lifted his head to the sound, whispering the child's name once, as if it were a prayer carried on the wind. Taya. The mountains seemed to answer in silence, the fire crackling steady, the night wide open, an old world finally making peace with a new one. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Crimson West. If you found a child the world had priced at $2, would you pay with gold or with your soul? Tell us in the comments below.